1945. The Big Apple. Summer is on its way out, its fading breath carrying the stench of death from across the sea. Atop a Manhattan skyrise, an exceptional man catches whiff of it, the scent of smoke and burning flesh, as 7,000 miles away, Hiroshima is engulfed in a torrent of heat and light. The Yanks call it the little boy. Andrew Ryan calls it the inevitability of atomic war and wants no part of the fallout. He's ready for a departure, not just from his adopted country, but from all countries, for there is no place on earth for men like him. A place where science and art and commerce are linked together in some great chain of prosperity, of progress. Utopia is a dream reserved for those with the will to build it. Andrew Ryan has the will, and he'll have to sink to the darkest depths to bring his utopia to life. Like many who immigrated to the United States, Andrew Ryan once went by a different name. Andrei Rayanovsky is born in a village on the outskirts of Minsk. Hailing from a bourgeois Jewish family, he's raised during a period of conflict and bloodshed, as his home sits uneasily on the front line of the First World War. He likely sees many things unfit for child eyes, but as foul and unpleasant as those things may be, they pale in comparison to the horrors to come. While I'd like to focus only on his upbringing, we really should consider the history behind the fiction, as it will provide context for the genesis of the ideologies that will shape Andrei Rayanovsky into Andrew Ryan. So, a quick history lesson. In 1914, the Russian Empire rung its death knell after its Tsar, Nicholas II, dragged the country into the First World War. February of 1917 saw the beginning of the Russian Revolution, in which the Tsarist autocracy was deposed. A power vacuum formed, with two factions vying for control of the empire: the Petrograd Soviet, which was a council of workers and soldiers, and the Provisional Government, which was a group of ministers who had served under Nicholas II. That vacuum would ultimately be filled by the Provisional Government. However, while never intended to be a permanent solution, it ended up being incredibly short-lived. The Provisional Government failed to satisfy the expectations of the common man. Peasant and soldier alike wanted a swift departure from the war. They wanted food. They wanted redistribution of the land to those who worked it. But the Provisional Government was reluctant to cede from the war, meaning the war effort would end up straining state resources and food supplies. Worse, they were beholden to laws which prevented them from passing any land reforms. This sowed the seeds for the rise of the Bolsheviks, a faction of the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labor Party who were led by Vladimir Lenin. He rallied support under the promise of peace, land, and bread, everything the peasantry were literally dying for. Later that year came the October Revolution, which saw the rising tide of communism engulf the country in an all-consuming sea of red. The Bolsheviks assumed control, and red became the new black as the revolution flooded into rural communities. While some landowners avoided bloodshed by relinquishing ownership of their homes, others drowned in a bloody wave of anarchy and barbarism. The peasantry would stream onto the estates of landowners, slaughtering livestock, torching manors, and slaying their owners. It's around this time when the Ryanovskys decide to flee Russia. While not wealthy, they enjoyed a bourgeois existence until the Bolsheviks ruined the family business. Andrei's father, Pyotr Ryanovsky, opposed the communists, a fact many of his neighbors were aware of. With the autocracy deposed, the men and women who once called the Ryanovskys friends were now denouncing them as betrayers of the People's Revolution. On the day of the purge, they narrowly escaped aboard a train to Constantinople. This is Andrei Rayanovsky's first exodus. In 1919, he and his father arrive in America, pursuing the elusive dream that brought many travelers to the New World: opportunity, prosperity, freedom. And the young Andrei has his name angelicized, becoming Andrew Ryan. While little else is known of his upbringing, we know that the events which forced him and his father from their motherland affects him deeply, creating a profound abhorrence for communist and socialist ideals.
In 1919, I fled a country that had been traded in despotism for insanity. The Marxist revolution simply traded one lie for another. Instead of one man, the Tsar, owning the work of all the people own the work of all of the people. And so, I came to America, where a man could own his own work. where a man could benefit from the brilliance of his own mind, the strength of his own muscles, the might of his own will.
Ryan is determined to make something of himself on the merits of his own ambition, of his own will, and he succeeds. Sort of. As a young man, he discovers an oil deposit and establishes a drilling company, becoming incredibly wealthy. However, according to Sullivan, the man who will one day serve as his head of security, Ryan actually struck oil by chance. Despite Ryan's talk of getting by on the might of his own merits, he owes most of his wealth to luck. Yet, despite this, Ryan does go on to invest his newfound fortune brilliantly. He becomes a titan of industry, owning a significant chunk of America's coal, its second biggest railroad, and his own oil company. However, while grateful for the wealth he amasses and the opportunity it affords him, he begins to grow disillusioned with certain facets of American government. It starts in 1929. The stock market crash helps usher in the Great Depression, resulting with countless banks and businesses closing and millions of people losing their jobs. Even before the crash, the quality of life for many Americans was at a bare subsistence level. Afterwards, however, there were food riots. Husbands and fathers desert their families en masse, and many of those families find themselves living in public parks and shanty towns. Desperate times begin to put into question the old American adage that if a man works hard enough, he can always take care of himself and his family. In response, President Franklin Roosevelt establishes the National Welfare System to provide relief to the millions of Americans left unemployed by the crash. Ryan looks upon this scornfully, equating it to the Marxist ideology that drove him from his motherland. That innocent lives were being lost matters little to him, as Ryan prescribes to a form of social Darwinism. In his eyes, if people die, it's because of their own inability to adapt. This philosophy leaves no room for altruism, for he considers it to be a means of justifying big government. In Ryan's world, either you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, or you latch yourself onto the straps of your betters. If you did the latter, you're no better than a parasite. And Ryan thought very little of parasites.
What is the difference between a man and a parasite? A man builds, a parasite asks, "Where's my share?" A man creates, a parasite says, "What will the neighbors think?" A man invents, a parasite says, "Watch out, or you might tread on the toes of God."
Ryan's beliefs are modeled around objectivism, the philosophical system developed by author Ayn Rand, which states that certain things, specifically moral truths, exist independently of human knowledge or perception. According to objectivism, the moral purpose of a man is to pursue his own personal happiness above all, and that the only social system which supports this goal is one which respects individual rights embodied through laissez-faire capitalism. Bioshock was never intended to be a master's thesis of this philosophy, but it does a good job of exploring why such a system isn't feasible. It keeps in mind the human factor. We'll discuss this more when the time comes. Ryan's philosophy dictates that a man can only own what he earns. So, it should come of no surprise that he abhors the idea of nationalization, the process of transferring private assets to public assets via state ownership or control. As a laissez-faire capitalist, he views the practice as big government overreaching by interfering with and controlling a citizen's economic affairs. Ryan is so critical of nationalization that he's not averse to burning his own proverbial cash.
On the surface, I once bought a forest. The parasites claimed that the land belonged to God and demanded that I establish a public park there. Why? So the rabble could stand slack-jawed under the canopy and pretend that it was paradise earned. When Congress moved to nationalize my forest, I burnt it to the ground. God did not plant the seeds of this Arcadia. I did.
The government wanted to nationalize his private forest. As a testament to his conviction, Ryan torched it. This act is actually a reference to Ayn Rand's novel, Atlas Shrugged. In her story, Ellis Wyatt, a capitalist, burns down his oil field for similar reasons, as he is unwilling to sanction the looters' system. In Rand's novel, the looters are actually synonymous with Ryan's parasites. In fact, there are a good number of parallels between Bioshock and Ayn Rand's magnum opus, and we'll cover many of them at the appropriate time. Elsewhere, a boy named Frank has his life upended in a way very similar yet very different to the way young Ryan did. Where Ryan's home was destroyed by the spread of unfettered communist ideals, Frank's was destroyed by wildfire commercialism. It starts when his father decides to do the very unfatherly thing of abandoning him at an orphanage. Considering Frank was born in 1920, it's likely this happened shortly after the stock market crash. Like every other child treading the tide of economic depression, Frank becomes another mouth to feed, another body to shelter. Suffice it to say, life is hard, so hard that Frank flees the orphanage, choosing uncertainty and squalor over the pitiful lot he's been cast into. Luckily for him, the boy finds work at a vaudeville theater. He's hired as a stagehand, yet, unknown to his employers, Frank is a gifted child with a natural eye for impersonation. He spends 3 years there, watching, studying the actors, the comedians, absorbing their techniques like a sponge. Their commitment to the roles through makeup, through costumes and pageantry impresses him. But what impresses Frank the most is how they delude the audience into truly believing the performance, that artifice is reality, and that leaves a lasting impression on him. Frank spends 3 years at the theater. The rest of his childhood and teen years are a bit of a mystery, but we do know at some point in time he seeps into the underworld of organized crime, as he comes under investigation by the FBI. They try to connect him to an interstate booking operation, but Frank is a wily one, always ending up where the evidence isn't. Using the skills he picked up at the theater, he assumes many false identities. Barris, Winston, Moskowitz, even a Chinese man named Wang. But Frank ultimately adopts the surname of Gorland. He sets up shop in New York City, where he establishes a bookmaking business and will eventually stumble across the grift of a lifetime, the details of which we'll save for the next episode. While all this is going on, the Second World War begins to rage overseas. There are 3 characters whose histories are important to the founding of Rapture involved in the war. For the sake of brevity, I won't cover them in any detail in this episode. However, I will introduce them as they will be discussed thoroughly in the future. The first of which is the girl from Minsk, Brigitte Tenenbaum. Born to a German father and raised in the Jewish faith, Brigitte is 16 years old when the Nazis occupy her village. She is taken prisoner and placed into a concentration camp. There is a great deal to discuss about her character, but as previously stated, we'll save it for later. The same goes for Yi Su-chong, the Korean geneticist who we were previously introduced to in episode 3 of this Bioshock lore series. The last figure in this triumvirate is Charles Milton Porter, a Chicago-born mathematician working as a codebreaker for Alan Turing. Each of these individuals will play a pivotal role in the future of Rapture, and I look forward to covering them. Sometime between 1943 and 1944, Ryan meets an ex-NYPD officer named Sullivan. Framed by someone or someones for accepting bribes, he is terminated from the force and has his pension revoked. Left with nothing but lingering feelings of guilt, Sullivan finds solace in crapshoot tables, until his wife runs off with the last of his cash. He's considering biting a bullet when he meets Ryan. Believing him to be a man of honesty and integrity, Ryan goes on to hire Sullivan as his private security chief. And all this preamble brings us back to the beginning, 1945. The Americans deploy the most powerful weapon ever devised, the Little Boy, and drop it on Hiroshima. 66,000 souls perish in the maelstrom, with countless others withering away from cancer caused by radiation poisoning. Sullivan is the one who informs Ryan of the news, and the magnate condemns the act, which is interesting because Ryan actually espouses the idea of science unburdened by morality. Yet he is critical of America's use of the bomb, meaning he does not condemn them for creating it, but for using it against his ideals. To Ryan, the atomic bomb is science profaned by parasites, as a weapon created to destroy anything they cannot claim as their own. It's not the act of destruction he is against. We know this because he destroys his private forest to prevent the US government from seizing control of it. No, Ryan is vehemently against parasitism. His ideals seem to be unmovable, and despite how solipsistic they may seem, you have to respect the man who sticks to his guns. There's almost something infallible in his conviction. However, Ryan is just a man, and as we'll eventually come to see, he's a hypocritical one at that, willing to defy his own principles when it benefits him the most.
I asked myself, in what country was there a place for men like me? Men who refused to say yes to the parasites and the doubters. Men who believed that work was sacred and property rights inviolate. And then, one day, The happy answer came to me, my friends. There was no country for people like me. And that was the moment I decided to build one.
Ryan is a pariah at the precipice, determined to create a country not just for himself, but for free-minded men who place work above country and the almighty dollar above the almighty himself. He uses his fortune to begin work on the North Atlantic Project, what he envisions as a utopia beneath the waves. Ryan reaches out to Simon and Daniel Wales of the architect firm Wales & Wales, commissioning them to design his utopia. The talents of the brothers are normally dedicated to their god, as they had designed many prominent cathedrals across their birthland of Ireland. Ironically, Ryan secures their genius to construct the cathedral, not to God, but to man's will. In 1946, a plumbing contractor named Bill McDonough is repairing the bathroom fixtures of a New York City suite. Having moved to America after working his way through engineering and mechanical school, Bill aspires to one day own his own plumbing company. Ryan, impressed by McDonough's work ethic and efficacy, offers him the job of general contractor for his North Atlantic project. Unsurprisingly, Bill McDonough accepts. Ryan begins scouting locations for the site of his utopia. He purchases 3 ships to function as his fleet, the largest of which he christens the Olympian and serves as his flagship. He eventually settles on a location, 63 degrees 2 minutes north by 29:55 minutes west, some 433 kilometers west of Reykjavik. Construction begins in late 1945, with the process of circumventing federal suspicion being as big a hurdle as the construction itself.
Of course, the buildings are being fabricated above the waves. But we will lower them on a lunette ring, submerged into the structure's steel frames. So much steel, you wonder. How will we keep so large a purchase from the government? Water is buoyant. We shall not frame Rapture in steel, but in aluminium. The government jackals may suspect me of building an air force, but never a city.
A state-of-the-art submersible is used to ferry supplies and workers to the seafloor, while prefabricated buildings designed by the Wales brothers in the Art Deco aesthetic of New York City are submerged and anchored into the foundation. Meanwhile, back on dry land, Ryan establishes a host of dummy corporations, using them to funnel money to suppliers in order to avoid suspicion from the US government. He is distrustful of them, paranoid that they would fear a nation that they could not regulate, a nation that they could not compete with. His utopia would be a community, a city, where art and science need not fear the censor or the moral. Unbound from the shackles which constrain them, they can flourish, progressing society forward in a way never before seen, with Ryan to govern it all, a despot of his very own Gulch. November 5th, 1946, is the day of Andrew Ryan's second exodus. His fortune, ambition, and vision yield success when the impossible becomes the achievable. Rapture, the modern-day Atlantis, takes its first breath, its lungs filling with the first of its residents. It will be another 5 years before the city is completed, but the triumph of this moment is beyond measure or dispute. A true shame, then, that it will be drowning in the waters of civil war in 13 years' time.